Evening, everybody. I'm so glad you tuned into today's version of Evaluation Headlines. We're very happy to have with us three of the leading thinkers and doers of evaluation in the field, and they're going to each share with us their version of what they think we as a community ought to be thinking about in the world of evaluation. We're going to have a conversation about each of those headlines, and then we'll turn to you, the audience, if you have any questions for any of us on those headlines. So I'd like now to turn to each of my colleagues and please just mention your headline. You can either do it in the style of the New York Times or the Daily Mail or something in between. Andreas, what is your headline?
Thank you very much, Mani. Colleagues, my headline is Climate Action and Climate Evaluations are complex, built on partnership, and aim to shift the paradigm.
Now, Carmen, your turn. What is your headline?
My headline is Crisis to Clarity. Digital transformation can play a major role in modern evaluation.
And Marie, what is your headline?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Very excited to be here with all of you. My headline is Key to better crisis response and development outcomes is fostering an evidence-informed culture.
Great. Now, thanks. So we are indeed live and alive this morning. And those are great headlines, but I think we're going to need a little bit more information about each of them as we have our conversation. So, Andreas, let me turn to you first. Tell us a little bit more about this climate change issue that you mentioned.
Thanks, Mani. So, colleagues, coming from the world's largest dedicated climate fund, which has just been in operation about 10 years or so, we ask ourselves the question, what is it? What are climate projects? What is climate change and climate action? And how can we evaluate it? So through our process of identifying this, we found a value proposition as evaluators. And our value proposition is to say, we're here as an independent unit to provide trusted evidence to inform the investment policies, which then would translate into a higher impact and hopefully a better Earth health. Now, along the way, we have identified three challenges. One is that climate projects are complex. This stems from the fact that climate change is a wide-ranging phenomenon that does not know any borders, any particular sectors, any local areas, or any countries. It's something, a common phenomenon that concerns all of us. And with that complexity, we need to work in a structured way. So climate action then, as a conclusion, a consequence, climate action is complex in structure. We need to work together across multiple sectors with multiple actors across multiple borders. So most of our projects are developed to combine two aspects, the aspect of nature as well as the aspect of human intervention in nature. So in recognizing this, we as evaluators, we need to embrace the complexity and work with that complexity in our daily work. The second point is we are building climate action on partnership. And that also means that we're building the evaluations of climate projects on partnerships. So this area of climate evaluations is built on collaboration with various stakeholders. in particular with stakeholders that we're not usually working with, and that is the private sector. The GCF, the Green Climate Fund, has the mandate to work together with the private sector, and the private sector has often a very different culture of how to look at impacts and how to go after impacts. So that is this question of partners and collaboration. So here we feel that as evaluators, we need to better understand that culture. We need to connect to these actors in the best way possible. That can be through methodologies. That can be through using certain data sources that we would usually not use. And that can also be linking with these collaborators from the get-go of the project all the way through to the end, to the evaluation and the learning component of every project. And the third aspect is the paradigm shifting aspect. So here we found ourselves in an environment where the fund assigns a role for both the projects as well as for evaluations that we need to look at paradigm shifting development pathways in climate change in order to have sustained climate action. The problem with this is that climate action, the problem with this is, apologies colleagues, that paradigm shift as such, as a concept, is not well defined. We're not alone in this game. We have done an analysis of major MDBs and other climate funds in the world, all of which struggle defining definitely the paradigm shift phenomenon. One way of how do we describe it is the degree to which the GCF can achieve sustained development impact beyond a one-off exercise. That also helps to create replicability as well as scale. So now, here in our work as evaluators, we need to recognize that projects in the climate adaptation space are particularly interesting for a paradigm shift, as they, in their setup, already combine multiple sectors, multiple actors, and therefore are trying to connect people as well as thoughts that are very much paradigm shifting. Thank you very much, Mani.
Thanks very much, Andreas. And I want to turn to my colleagues here. I'm sure you won't disagree with Andreas about the importance of addressing climate change. But he raised really important points. Complex, really hard problem. Partnerships, we need to work together. And paradigm shifting, we need to really transform ourselves. Let me turn to you, Carmen, to get your perspective from the World Bank's point of view on some of these issues, especially on what Andreas mentioned about having to work with the private sector, which some of us sometimes aren't used to, but I know you are.
Thank you, Mani. And I could not agree more with Andreas on your points. I think from our side on the World Bank, we see it very similar. So I want to say that first, as you mentioned, for us, climate is at the core of everything. So it's really cross-cutting. And when we're evaluating the work of the World Bank group, so it's not only the public side, but also, as you mentioned, Mani, the private side, what the IFC or MIGA are doing, we try to take a one World Bank group approach. And what we have been seeing in our evaluations, because they're cross-cutting, is not that we have a single one that is just on climate, but we have on the agri-food systems, we have on biodiversity, circular economy. We also have one we did recently on the enabling environment of the private sector for climate action. And on that one, it was very clear, as you mentioned, that partnership was critical for the whole World Bank group, not only internally among the three institutions, but also to work with other partners. And one interesting finding in the evaluation about the private sector enabling environment was that we found out that in terms of the climate finance, there were some gap, that enough was not being done. A lot of work of the institution have been going to mitigation, not so much to adaptation, and to take it to the next level of what the needs are for climate action. The evaluation showed that you needed to develop more capital markets. You needed to work on carbon pricing. You needed to figure out how you bring the public and the private sector together to really have the impact that is needed, because otherwise the needle will not be moved. We also do, beyond evaluations, work with the operational people. Many of you know climate co-benefits. So we look at the climate co-benefits of the institution, whether they're tracking correctly where the money is going. But as you know, there is big ambitions for the World Bank Group to even scale up more the financing on climate. So I think our role as the independent evaluation group of the bank is even more important. And again, I think the 3 points that you mentioned, Andreas, really resonate with what we're seeing in the evaluation work that we're doing.
Thanks, Carmen. And Marie, let me turn to you. You've heard 2 big players in the climate financing space with huge aspirations to move their work forward. You also mentioned some challenges, including on data, not the least. But from 3IE's point of view, as the leading think tank and generator of evidence, what is your perspective on this?
Thank you, Manny. Very interesting, the point that Andreas was making about, this is and as we all know, this is a global issue, but we also know that the actions that are taken are often at the country level, at the regional level, and so the outcomes, etc., that need to be measured along the way are often at that level. And at 3IE, what we do, among others, is to compile what we call evidence gap maps, which are basically sort of visual maps that show, in the relevant intervention areas, relevant programs, and for relevant outcomes, and from output to outcome to impact, they map out the evidence, both impact evaluations, systematic reviews. And these maps show both where the evidence is, but importantly also where the gaps are. Now, one of the interesting things that we've seen is that in our recent EGMs, one on sustainable energy, another on land use change and forestry programs in the Global South, have seen an increase in the amount of evidence available. But it's not at all at the pace and we would expect with the kind of crisis we are talking about and the amount of money going into it. And so one area is to point out that while we can map this, there are lots of gaps, and the point has been made that it is hugely underfunded, the research in this area. What I read was that the natural and technical sciences receive 770% more funding than the social sciences for research on issues related to climate change. The other part, and interestingly, we talked about sort of course, the interaction between climate change outcomes, but also with poverty, with inequality, with social outcomes. And one of the things we find in the evidence base that we have is that these interactions are usually lacking. So in climate change evaluations, we find very seldom that you look at the social impacts, whether they be positive or negative. And so that is certainly an area that is of concern. And then we see huge gaps. For example, a lot in the sustainable energy, we find very little outside of China and India in terms of the Global South. We also find, for example, in the road and infrastructure programs, there's hardly any evidence around effects on forests and effect on climate change. Lots to be done.
Thanks a lot, Marie. And as a consumer of evidence gap maps, I think they're immensely helpful. And as I recall, one of the things we found in these evidence gap maps is sometimes institutions work in those areas, not where there's a great density of evidence, but where there is sparse evidence. And I was wondering, I could turn to both Andreas and Carmen, on what are your institutions doing in either case? When there's dense evidence, are they systematically mining them before they get into these things? If there's sparse evidence, are they building in evaluations to make sure they're learning? Andreas, you first.
Thanks.
And no advertisements, please.
Thanks, thanks, Manny, for this question. Look, one thing that we recognize, and we've really embraced evidence gap maps as well at the IEU, at the GCF. We looked at, the first question that we ask ourselves is, how much evidence do we have currently in the climate space? And we looked at it in 2018, and we found that before 2015, in the literature, in the global literature, climate change adaptation was not even mentioned. Or if it was mentioned, only sparsely. When we then looked a little bit deeper, we recognize that there are certain areas where there is where there is an absolute gap, as you said. And most often we recognize this in certain sectors that we looked at. So for instance, the water sector was hugely underserved. As well as when you think about the outcomes, we found that enabling environment, and Carmen, I couldn't agree more with what you said, the enabling environment is key for private sector investments. It's a different type of enabling environment, as well as for the public sector. And we recognize that the enabling environment is a massive gap. In consequence, the fund has said, okay, if we were to think about our investments and we overlaid our evidence gap map and climate change adaptation within finance heat map. So we looked at an intervention heat map which just shows the financial flows of our organization across the same map. And we found that for readiness, we would certainly be ready to help countries to get ready. There's a lot of ready now, but to get ready in these particular areas about enabling environments. And through the process of improvements, internal improvements in the institution, we've recognized that enabling environments need to be at the forefront of our discussion and need to be happening at best prior to project implementation. For the projects, and I will close with this, for the projects, it's a mixed bag because we're operating under the principle of country ownership. So we're country owned, we're receiving the requests that countries have, and we're trying to make sense of them. So there's less to say about the sectoral approaches there.
No, that's great to hear about how you overlay your operations on top of gap maps to see where exactly there are these vulnerabilities. Carmen, very quickly, any reactions from the World Bank?
Yes, so I want to go on two specificities on what we have seen on some evidence gaps on two evaluations we have done. And many of you know that the World Bank group had started recently a new core analytics. It's a new diagnostic related to climate. It's what we call the CCDRs, the Country Climate and Development Reports. And recently on our blue economy evaluation, we saw that in certain countries, such as, for example, Indonesia, the blue economy was missing in the CCDRs. So for us, in the evaluation, we have sent a very strong message to the bank to say, you cannot forget a piece so important for climate, such a blue economy. And now that these core analytics are relatively new, they've been only in business for about a year and a half or two, is the time that the institution really takes into account these pieces that are really an evidence gap. We saw the same thing on the CCDRs for the private sector evaluation that I mentioned, the one on the enabling environment. There were beautiful diagnostics done in many of the countries that were talking about how much money was needed to be financed for climate in country A or B. But the reality was that was not realistic. It wasn't saying enough how that funding was going to be coming from. And therefore, a recommendation to say you need to concentrate on the financing aspect. How are you going to help countries to develop the markets to attract the funding that is needed? So those are two specific samples of evidence gaps that we have seen in evaluations.
Thanks very much, Carmen. And let me now ask you to continue, actually, on telling us a little bit more about your headline. Digitalization.
Great. So as you saw, my headline talks about digital transformation. And I'd like to invite you to think about that at two different levels. A very high level of what it means for us as evaluator to help our institutions to evaluate their impact on digital transformation. And secondly, what are the tools based on digital transformation that as evaluators we can be using, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, to do our work more efficiently and more agile? So let me start really quick with the first one. We all know that traditional development has changed, and has changed due to the disruption of technologies. And it happened before COVID, but COVID pandemic really showed the power of digital transformation. We saw it in many countries, even in the region, in Vietnam, in Philippines. And when there are crises, digital transformation has the power to help us. Of course, it brings opportunities and it brings challenges. So because right now the traditional development is different, I think ourselves as evaluators, we have an amazing opportunity to help our institutions to have more impact in this area. I think we're all struggling with theory of change about digital transformation in our institutions. And if any of you in the audience is not, please raise your hand because I want to talk to you. But I want to say that despite this might be new for all of us, how do we really evaluate proper digital transformation programs that are being done? In 2021, we did in IG already an evaluation that we look at different pillars of what we call disruptive and transformative technologies, 5 of the pillars of the DTT. It shows that the World Bank was doing the right thing. It was doing the right thing in terms of advisory, of being a broker, of having a convening power, in really mobilizing fundings for IDA. But it showed that this is such a fast-paced industry that it didn't have the necessary skills. And if you fast forward to 2024 today, we have actually a new vice presidency since July 1st that is just going to concentrate on digital development in the World Bank Group. So I think that's very important. As IG, we're working with them to develop that theory of change because we think it's super important to help them to understand what is the challenge of cyber security. Where are the challenges of bringing the shift in the economic growth of the countries because of the artificial intelligence and robotics? How does private capital mobilization can help out to have a more conducive environment which is needed for what is called green digitalization? Because you cannot keep continuing digitalizing if you're hurting the environment. But how do you do it in a way that is green? So that's on the first aspect. How do we work together to really evaluate our institutions in the big, big picture? Secondly, what do we have as the tools? And yesterday there was a fascinating session in the afternoon led by our UN colleagues that they really talk about where are the opportunities and the cost and challenges of artificial intelligence. I have to say that in IG, we've been using since the pandemic, since 2020, quite a bit of artificial intelligence. We've been doing it in order to use machine learning to be much more efficient with our portfolio reviews. For example, we're, as we speak, working on an evaluation of the World Bank environmental and social framework. And we need to look at 1,500 projects. Imagine, if we wouldn't have artificial intelligence and machine learning, we will be here forever, right? So we're using some of the coding to help us to do a first cut of what we see in this portfolio review. But of course, as the colleagues from the UN point out yesterday, you have to have the human component. So again, I think there is a lot of potential for artificial intelligence and machine learning in the work we do, and we need to embrace it, but we cannot forget that there are the challenges. There are the challenges of the ethical dilemmas, the challenges that the natural component has to be there. And as it was pointed out yesterday, artificial intelligence and machine learning and all the digital transformation should be an assistant for us as evaluators to do our work better. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Carmen. So artificial intelligence requires real intelligence. So Marie, let me turn to you. And you've been looking at the data and the evidence across the world. What do we know about the effectiveness of using AI for the outcomes we want to achieve?
We haven't looked at that yet. But we are. But
we
so
should.
We should. We haven't gotten that there. And if somebody wants to commission us to look at it, you know, please. But what I would like to build on here is, yeah, the fantastic sessions we had on this, I agree. And I think what came out and what Carmen mentioned as well was this idea that it is great, right? It is actually fostering this information-seeking behavior that already the web started doing. And I think the worry, I think, that we all heard in the sessions was the worry around not only information-seeking, but actually becoming overly dependent and relying on these tools. And I think being sort of using it as aids rather than sort of intelligence, as it were, I think came out. You know, one thing that you know I took from Marco Segone, who had said to his staff, you know, don't worry, you won't. I will not. I don't think I will be replaced by AI. but I will be replaced by somebody who knows more about AI than myself. I thought that was excellent. And in that spirit, I think we have very much embraced trying things out in 3IE and how we can use this. I'd say, machine learning is something we've already done for quite a few years. It's a bit 2010 already, I would say. And we found, for example, just doing systematic reviews where we systematize the body of evidence on certain issues, we managed, and typically for one systematic review, we would sort of have to screen 80,000 reports, right? So machine learning has allowed us to cut that screening time by about 70%. So that's just, but the other thing now, using Gen AI, we've been starting to pilot how we can deploy Gen AI and chatbots in particular on our curated databases. So this, you've heard me mention the development evidence portal. Now, what if a chatbot can help you, sort of, you can query it, you can have prompts, and it will sort of come and answer you what is in there. In this 17,000 impact evaluations, it will come out and tell you what is relevant to you. That's something we are experimenting with. And already we've sort of have some lessons around that. The good news is, of course, because it's a curated database, it's not going to go out and invent evidence that we haven't screened. And that's, I think, something very important to keep in mind. But it is sort of a problem because we know what kind of evidence is in there. It's certain types of evidence. It's impact evaluation, effectiveness evidence. It's not, for example, UN evaluations, other types of evaluations. It's hence, you need to be quite specific about what kind of prompts will give you unbiased answers. What can be answered by the evidence in there and what cannot. And so what we're experimenting with now is actually to develop sort of prompts and then sort of that we can present to the users so that they know about which kind of questions they could ask and get good answers to. And I think that is our main worry is basically that we want to really ensure that, or rather think about how much filtering and how much interpretation we want to do ourselves before we sort of let policymakers lose on these tools and who are maybe less acquainted with what is good and bad evidence. And just to say, one thing that the AI does very badly is to distinguish between low confidence systematic reviews, low quality impact evaluations, and medium and high, for example. So there's no way that for at least a very long time, this will able to, it will do it alone.
Great, Marie. So as we go barreling down the digital highway, we need guardrails, and I think that's a very important point. Andreas, if there's one area, as you said, that requires paradigm shifting, it's climate change, and if there's one area that could use transformative innovations, it's digital transformation. What is happening in your field?
Thanks, Fanny. I think in regards to digital transformation, we see that, and I alluded to this a little bit, climate and climate projects as well as evaluations are inherently complex. We recognize that through the work that we've done in trying to decipher and to unpack impact, we recognize that on one hand, we can definitely speak to developmental impacts. We can also speak to something in between those and climate adaptation, climate resilience, and mitigation. And those in between are somewhere between food security, food consumption, when we talk about the agricultural sector, water security, when we talk about the water sector as an example. But we're still unable to fully look at what is that leading to. So this question of what is transformational change has been a long-standing difficult part for our organization, and that's not only from the perspective of implementation challenge. It's also in terms of conceptualizing what sort of change we would want to see in climate projects. And here for us, the digital component becomes very important because it helps us, and we've done this work at the IAU, it helps us to create a set of signals that would lead to transformational change, if you want a paradigm-shifting potential of projects. And what we did is we looked through the literature, we looked through our work and identified 8 different drivers, different signals that would show transformational change that would likely come down the line. And for us, the digital aspects, the aspects of big data, the aspects of using GIS more comprehensively in the quest to understand paradigm-shifting elements in climate projects has been really allowing us to leapfrog a little bit. One thing that I want to give away with what we found, and I don't want to speak too much of it because it's still ongoing, but what we found already is when we look at all these 8 signals, we find that adaptation projects have a particular advantage because they take a lot of these signals as they are inbuilt in the projects that look both at a nature component, a natural science component, as well as an anthropological component, a human aspect, a social and economic aspect. And here we find that adaptation projects really are far more ready to be transformational. Again, helping us, the digital elements helping us to decipher that even more.
And I suppose it's because for transformational change, you really need behavioral change as opposed to changes in policies or investments or anything else. And I was just wondering if any of you have any reflections on the power of technology to actually encourage behavioral change or indeed to measure it. Well, that put a damper on things.
I have a related thought. I don't know if it's quite, but I do think, in terms of at least in the area of theory of change, which is sort of something we all love and so on, I do think there's a lot of potential to query, use artificial intelligence, for example, to query and come up with alternative theories, alternative assumptions to sort of, in a sense, a critical friend that sort of comes up with ideas that we haven't had ourselves. And it's a big friend, right? It draws on the whole world. So,
and I can imagine also behavioral nudges can be facilitated by technology. And I often wonder why even within our own organizations, we don't use more of such nudges and evaluate them to see whether our new operating models are working relative to the old ones, for example.
Could I add one more thing?
Sure.
Just briefly, I mean, I think also interesting to say, we're seeing a lot of demand for training from very new evaluators, especially, for example, in Africa. We work in West Africa with the researchers and evaluators, and the demand for training on both sort of big data and also on Gen AI and so on, I think it's quite interesting. And interesting for us as a community to think about the new generation learning AI at the same time as evaluation. What does that do? I think it's potentially there will, some really fantastic innovations will come up. Probably we also need to again watch out for what biases or anything that we wouldn't want in there. But I think it's a really exciting time.
I'm glad you raised that because Carmen, you raised the point about building up skills within the World Bank, and you're hiring data scientists and everything else. And I'm just wondering what kinds of initiatives are being done to make sure that it's not just hiring more data scientists, but that the people who've been there for a while, I was there for 30 years, so I know, it's hard to change. And what kinds of things are you doing to train them up in a way that makes them more conversant with these technologies?
Yeah. No, this is a great point, and it's funny. I was talking to someone in the audience who knew one of my staff and said, this person that you have about 7 years ago was doing machine learning, and everybody in IEG looked at him like someone weird. And I said, well, he's now the most popular person, I can tell you. But indeed, what we're doing is training. We're deploying a lot of internal training in IEG in terms of machine learning, and also one piece I didn't mention that we're also starting to do a lot is geospatial. Using some of the geospatial work that, and in the World Bank, they have great teams that have been working in geospatial for many years. But how does that help us to bring some of the evidence, right? And we're starting to put that in some of our evaluations. There is one we're going to be doing on electricity access in sub-Saharan Africa. And yeah, we're going to be looking at geospatial because that's probably the only way we can really go and trying to find in very rural areas in Africa, what is the evidence of whether the connections happen or not, right? So going back to your point, yes, we have to be doing a lot of training. We're also doing what we call experimentation. So again, with this machine learning and with the coding that we're doing inside of the project, ourselves internally, we're learning. We're trying to figure out, is this the way forward? Is this effective or not? Are we getting from the technology really good data or not? Or because, as someone said yesterday, garbage in, garbage out, right? So yes, it's a behavioral change, but we're really pushing it, and we're hiring also a lot of data scientists, which is, I think, for the first time in IG that's been done in a long time. Like we're hiring 5 or 6 as we speak, right? So I think there is a lot of push to do that.
Thank you very much. Keep in mind, we're going to try to spend at least a few minutes at the end for your questions. So get those brain cells working and be ready. But Marie, over to you on your headline. A little bit more detail.
Yes. So I want to make 2 points. So the first point is about how we want to, how important it is to be prepared for crisis. So initially, at moments of crisis, senior policymakers they typically are not very focused on evaluating what they're doing. They are under a lot of pressure. Some of you are policymakers, you're under a lot of pressure to do something and to be seen to be doing something. And even sometimes if that's just sort of almost like just throwing anything against the wall and see if it sticks, right? It's almost at that level. But one thing that we saw early in the pandemic is that during those moments of crisis, there's still a lot of appetite from policymakers that are keen to know what has worked before. So, they're very interested in previous results of past evaluations. And so this is where the existence of resources that give rapid access to existing evidence is key. And you've heard me already mention the development of evidence portal of 3IE, which is a global public evidence good. Searchable, available to all of you. We also use it for rapid evidence assessment, help desk to help extract the evidence for policymakers. However, good global public evidence goods like that are always, and we heard it in other sessions, always underfunded. A little plug for our dear host here, ADB, which is the only MDB that supports supports the DP. But also, it is a problem that these public evidence goods more generally are underfunded, and it's a risk. Other organizations have also such offerings. We heard about EVA, IDA, and other databases. Yeah. And again, these are sort of jewels when it comes to a moment of crisis. Now, later in the COVID crisis cycle, for example, policymakers were increasingly interested in rapid feedback on what they were testing, right? And they're interested in real-time evaluations, in the results of the natural experiments that were going on, etc. And so we as evaluators need to be prepared to be flexible and to move quickly. But for all of these endeavors to happen, flexible resources also need to be available. And, my question is, in a sense, could the ADB, the World Bank, GCF, et cetera, or others, have mechanisms in place for resources in crisis, not only for the programs, but also explicitly to ensure that they are getting evaluated, that they get the best evidence quickly. So that's, my first point. My second point is about strengthening the evidence culture in your organizations, in international development organizations, and the role that evaluators can play. So in my previous capacities, I have overseen several what you call corporate evaluations or institutional evaluations that have been looking at how international development institutions learn and use evidence. And I also reviewed others. So I can just mention, the World Bank had this done, NORAD. Recently, DEVAL did that for German cooperation, African Development Bank, etc. The findings are strikingly similar across all these independent evaluations. There's a lack, first one, there's the lack of institutional incentives, consistent signals, role modeling from the top of the organizations that evaluations and evidence use are important. That's the first. The second is that success is measured by project approvals and disbursements of funds, and not by results and outcomes on the ground. Yeah. So these are very common findings. And so one thing we've done in 3IE is, together with several leading international development institutions, we launched the Global Evidence Commitment last year, with an opening by the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, who is very committed to changing or moving the needle on development effectiveness of that institution. The other organizations that are signatories to date include so the IDB, USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, UK's FCDO, NORAD, Germany's KfW. So we are in total so far 7 institutions. They have committed to improving the use of relevant evidence all through the program cycle. And we in 3IE have also developed a tool that we call TRIPS, which basically describes the 5 levers that organizations have at hand to change the evidence culture. Training, resources, incentives, processes, and signals from the top. And from 3IE's perspective, what we will be doing is in particular to push for the use of evaluation and real assessment of the measures that all these organizations are taking to try to change the evidence cultures. We're trying to use our own tools to these organizational changes. And that's what we're pushing these organizations to do. And we're still at the early stages of the GEC to see, to make it a sharing and learning community. And it will be open to other organizations as we see that it brings value. Just to add very briefly on this is that I think independent evaluation offices, as you heard, I referred to evaluations from independent evaluation offices that led to this finding, this community. And I think, hopefully you will continue. I think it's important that you continue to play a role to evaluate whether your organizations get better at learning and get better outcomes on the ground. I also think a question for independent evaluation offices is, what is your role within the TRIPS framework? Which levers are you helping, and how do you evaluate your own role in improving the effectiveness of these organizations? And then finally, partner country governments, I think, should also hold the development banks and organizations accountable for bringing the best evidence-informed approaches to the countries. Because that would be the ultimate, in the TRIPS framework, that would be the ultimate incentive, I think, for the international development organizations to push this agenda further.
I can tell you one thing, Marie, in the ADB, we have often tripped up in trying to improve our evidence culture. So it is a great agenda for the future. But let me turn to first Andreas and then Carmen. I can't think of anything more consequential than making sure that the evidence we produce is consequential. Marie brought up this issue of evidence as a public good and also changing culture. What are you doing in your institutions on this? First, Andreas.
Thanks, Mani. From the top of my head, one thing that we found in our evaluations, and in a particular one when we looked at the private sector, is that we ought to think about our own organizations and the cultural shifters that we need to lead. What I mean by this is, I said it before, collaboration is key both in climate action but also in the evaluation space. Now, since we are working closely with the private sector, we found that there are a couple of things that we need to think about. It's sort of a small roadmap of 5 things that we got to think about in terms of getting there as an organization and being closer to the private sector. And one first one was, and I'm paraphrasing this, I hope you don't mind, be the catalyst. That would be the first point. And what we mean by this is really think about a quality impact. Don't think about co-finance, think about quality impact, and that's be the catalyst for impact with the private sector. The second point that we made was we found that in order to be country-driven, you've got to have a plan. So be country-driven with a plan. And I think that speaks very much to what we've talked about before when we look at the capacities that we need in the countries in order to do that. The third one is there's a cultural and a behavioral shift needed. We speak both different languages, both the public sphere as well as the public sphere. We ought to think about how we can make this journey together, both from an intervention perspective, but also from a perspective of data, on how we're bringing the data, how we're bringing relevant learnings to the table that help both both ends of this collaboration. The fourth is a build capacity for policy. We recognize that an enabling environment is key, also for the private sector. So we got to think about how we can build this capacity, in particular, for the enabling environment of our projects. And lastly, we said that enabling environments in general are often overlooked. We think about the impact, we think about the intervention and the impact, but we're not thinking about how to get there enough. And that is something that we brought to the table as an independent evaluation unit, because we really made sure in our impact evaluations that we enter from the get-go in a collaboration together with the project teams to define what are we after and how do we get there, and in a way trying to push the frontier a little bit and saying we don't want to do ex post evaluations only. We want to do a collaborative approach for a developmental evaluation, learning on the go, at best in real time. And I'm not meaning real time in terms of data, I'm meaning real time in terms of feedback and learning on the spot. That's what I can share.
That's great. In fact, that's something that Tim Harford mentioned in day one of this conference, in which he said, start your evaluations whenever the intervention starts. Carmen.
So great that you mentioned Tim Harford, because I wanted to start with that. I wanted to go back to that first day on the evidence talk, and he talked about being a soldier or being a scout. And I've been reflecting a lot on that, and I actually think we should be both. And that's really at the core of this. If we really want to create learning institutions, in the institutions we're evaluating, you have to be both. You cannot be one or the other, right? So I could not agree more with Maria and Andreas in terms of the partnerships and the collaborations that we need to have as independent evaluators with the other side of the street, with the management, with the teams, right? And that's very important if we want to create that accountability and learning culture. It's not easy. I think it's easier in some parts in the World Bank Group than in others. In terms of crisis, as an evaluator, I think we need to be asking the right question at the right time for the right audience. And I tell my teams, if we produce a beautiful report that it goes into a shelf, we have not done our job. Actually, when it gets approved at our board is when our work is starting to transfer that knowledge to the institution. And in times of crisis, that is super important because they need us the most. They need to learn what they did wrong so they don't make the same mistake. But we need to adjust, as Mary said. We need to be flexible, because if we give them 200-300 pages, they don't have the bandwidth when they're in crisis to read our reports. So I think we need to think different. And what are we doing in the World Bank different? During these times of crisis, we have produced some just-in-time notes, evaluation insight notes, that maybe they're just 10 pages, bringing the evidence of different, evaluations or work we have done that we can then share with them, and then they have it in a very readable, easy way to digest. Also, we were asked to do more early stage evaluations. And I have to say that is a trade-off that we could be here forever talking about it, right? Because we did early stage evaluations on the COVID pandemic, what was the economic impact, but also what was the health response. And of course, when you come with that evidence, you cannot go all the way to impact, to outcomes, because it's too early. Yeah. But management really needed, because they needed to do course correction in terms of the projects and the programs they were doing. And last but not least, what I think is super excited, and sometimes it keeps me awake at night, is what we're trying to do with the International Finance Corporation. As you pointed out, Andreas, it's very different to work with the private sector, and we're working with them at a very high level in the institution to create a self-evaluation culture, because you will be surprised. They don't have that. They don't have self-evaluation for every investment they're doing. And we're working with them, and we're putting it with the angle of the learning, because if we create that and we change their governance for them to own that, then I think we will move the needle a lot in terms of transferring the knowledge there.
That's really interesting, because in one of the sessions earlier, in fact, we have all been subject to private sector evaluations, and we don't even know it. Yeah. Because Google and all the tech industries, they're always doing randomized controlled trials on us. So why do you think it's so difficult to get them to think of these outcomes? And it's not just to you, Carmen. I know it's a difficult question. Why are we having a hard time having this conversation with the private sector on development outcomes? Is it because their own metric for success is so clear in the past, making money, that developmental impacts are just not in the forefront?
I have my own opinion, but let Maria and Andreas come in.
I mean, I think one of the things that, I mean, in my previous hat at the IEG, and also overseeing some large evaluations that included the private sector, I remember at least that data access was a huge issue. And it wasn't always clear whether that was a fig leaf or not. So I don't have a proper answer to saying why it is, but it's certainly that came in the way of good and timely evaluation.
Andreas,
my reflection on private sector would be it's not like, let's define what is private sector. Because what we recognize at the GCF is private sector is most often local. Okay. We're talking about MSMEs, we're talking about mid-sized companies that do make the climate action work. We're hardly ever talking about the large corporations, the large banks. We do have them, but we're often seeing private sector finance as local. And local private sector has a different set of capacity, a different set of vision on how far it would go. I think I'm in line with what you said, Carmen. They would probably not think as far as a global common good.
Okay.
However, just to end this thought, however, we also saw that we have nowadays new kids on the block. We have financial institutions that call themselves impact investors. And impact investors is an interesting bunch. Here we see a readiness to understand data. Here we see a readiness to understand impact. But at the same time, they always struck for time. So there it's the question of predictability. How quick can a large organization that's the GCF move into and gear up to work with impact investors?
Thank you. Carmen, any very quick observation?
So very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. I wouldn't say it's difficult, I will say it's different. And we need to wear a different hat as evaluators when we are evaluating the private sector, because the constraints, the pressures they're going through are very different than the public sector. And we saw it, for example, when a lot of geopolitical situations change, the portfolio of, for example, the International Finance Corporation. As the evaluator, we have to kind of recalibrate how we were using our matrix, because we could not penalize them for things that were not under control for them. Yeah.
Thank you. You've heard the evaluators. We have time for a few questions. So who would like, I cannot actually see anybody, but I see a couple of hands, a hand raised here. So please, can someone give him the microphone? Please make your interventions, your questions very crisp and short, because we want a couple of questions. Go ahead, please. And please identify yourself. Yeah, just speak.
Yeah. Very excellent discussion. In fact, I think if we are sitting here for maybe whole day also wouldn't be enough. I'm Ibrahim, Assistant Auditor General from the Auditor General's Office of the Maldives. Yeah, I've got a good lot of things to ask. I mean, questions to ask from the panel, but
So just one
I'm going to make
question,
it very
please.
short, as
Yeah.
Mani has said.
Yeah.
Andreas was talking about 8 different drivers that GCF has identified, right, for innovation. I would like to know what are those 8 different drivers, of course in short, because we'll not be able to talk for long, yeah? And the other question is about the private sector. You also have said, Andreas, that when it comes to attracting bigger businesses from the private sector for funding climate-related climate change and adaptation and resilience projects, it's always a challenge at the moment. I know the reason, because it's to do with profit, right? So the public good is something that maybe the private sector, the bigger ones, are not taking that seriously as maybe the public sector. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's take a couple of more, if we can.
Hi, Sven Harten from. Oh yes, now it was. Sven Harten from Debal, Germany.
Who's this?
Great panel. Thanks. Really enjoyed listening to you. 3 quick points. So IFC, in my very biased opinion, 15 years ago had a world-leading evaluation system. In fact, we won the President's Innovation Award for an RCT. It was a conscious decision of senior management to restructure and to abolish this, which says something about IFC, but also about the value of our evaluations, because if you're valuable, then you don't get restructured. So that's one. And Carmen, great to see that now this is picking up. Andreas, really liked your points, and obviously you and your organization, you're world leading in terms of transformational change, and great to hear about your work. I'm quite relieved to hear from the entire panel another call for evaluators to transform themselves. Because if you go to some other conferences, you hear Michael Quinn-Patton saying, well, you need to get rid of everything and completely transform yourself. So the call for getting better, reforming ourselves, but sticking to things that we do good is really resonating with me. So maybe some few thoughts from you guys on the role of transformation of our profession. And I'll keep it just there.
Thanks. Okay, one last one.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm Dr. Mugdha Mazhab from International Food Policy Research Institute. One thing I think is not getting proper attention, the environmental cost of using AI. As economists, we'd like to think about general equilibrium effects. As evaluators, I think we should be very clear about the environmental or the carbon footprint that we're leaving using all these AI models. I can see the benefit of it, but I think we have to be very clear about the cost that we are incurring as well. For example, BART-based model, there is like estimation of 0.3 to 2.5 kg of carbon dioxide in the environment using 1,000 queries. Yeah. And still we do not know that how much parameters ChatGPT 4.5 is using, because they are not releasing the data, right? So I think whenever we are using AI model for evaluation, I think we should estimate the cost that we are incurring as well, so that we have a clear cost-benefit analysis. I'd love to hear from you about it. Thank you.
Thank you. So they're not all specific questions, but I'm going to give you each 1 minute to just reflect if you have. But Andreas, there were couple of points that were directed right at you. So Andreas, you first.
Thanks. Thanks. To the model, I should acknowledge we're working together with other partners, most importantly the different climate funds in the Transformational Change Learning Partnership Initiative that's currently headed by the CIVs, the Climate Investment Funds of the World Bank. We have used their model to try to perfect it even further. So with the 8 components and drivers for transformational change, not for innovation, but transformational change is permanence, demonstration ability, which is important for replication, innovation, depth, complementarity, coherence, scale, policy change, and behavioral change. And I think through the discussion today, we may have almost spoke to every single one of them. That's the model that we are driving. It's not a model that is approved by any type of institutional governance structure. It's simply what we have developed as evaluators to make sense for sense-making exercises. That's all.
Thank you. Carmen.
So two quick points. One on how do we transform ourselves, right? And I fully agree. We're at a time that we need to embrace that, yes, that there's a lot of coming our way in the world, in development, in the evaluation world, but we really need to transform ourselves if we don't want to get out of business. I mean, let's be honest, right? We cannot do business as usual. And as many of you have heard me in the World Bank, they start the evolution roadmap discussions about almost 2 years ago. Yeah. And I remember telling my colleagues in IEG, we need to be thinking at that time already, how do we do our own evolution as IEG, right? So I think it's important, and a few key messages in my mind of how we need to evolve, we need to become agile. I mean, seriously, we need to be quick in our foot, and that means also building quick relationship that we understand all the pieces of the puzzle they're changing, because there are too many. And they're changing so quick that maybe in 2 months, if we don't know what's going on the other side, we're not able to come and evaluate, right? So I think that's super important. I couldn't agree with you more. And on the point on the footprint for the artificial intelligence, very well point taken. As I have mentioned briefly before, in the World Bank, they're also looking at what they call this green digitalization, which goes both ways, right? It's helping climate change interventions to bring more the digital transformation, but also to ensure that anything that is done in that digital transformation space is green, right? And as you pointed out, there are trade-offs, and one will have to really measure, okay, does it make sense to use artificial intelligence when it has all that cost for the environment versus, not using it? And I'm kind of thinking here, the 1,005 projects that I mentioned for our evaluation, right? It's a trade-off there, but I think it's important, and I know in the World Bank they have that in their mind, right? The green digitalization.
Thank you, Carmen. Marie, any quick class?
Quick, okay. On the environmental cost of use of AI, I think that's a great point. At 3IE, we started costing our carbon footprint in terms of travel, and I think great to find out. I think I'll investigate this, but we also have trying to also look at the benefits. You know, our evidence gap maps also have obviously benefits, especially if you all use them. So we're trying to get to that. But good point. And I think on terms of the transformation of the field, I think the localization agenda is super important. We need to work in the countries together, and 3IE is very committed to that. I think we, as a larger community, are not there yet in a real way. And the other thing is, in terms of all of us as evaluators, seeing ourselves as agents of change. We are in conversations with our institutions, with policymakers, and our job doesn't stop with the report. And so, and in 3IE, again, we just started recently developing some sort of conversation guide or whatever, ways to train our staff, for example, on how to have these kind of conversations. And I think we can all get much better at that. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for tuning in to this year's version of Evaluation Headlines. My own headline is AEW 2024, huge success. Evaluators brilliantly discuss the future issues that are consequential for people and planet. So please join me in a round of applause for our great panel. Please stay tuned as we run the video highlights from this year's AER.
takeaways from this year's Asian Evaluation Week is basically to use evidence in a better way for our decision making going forward. We have identified that while we're collecting good data, I think there's still a step to make to include it in our decision making processes. One thing we'd like to see change in next year's Asian Evaluation Week is to give a stronger voice to those countries that are not as represented in this year's panels, and we'd like to see the Pacific to feature a little bit more prominently in the discussion points next year.
The inclusive approach, the collective approach is important. So therefore, I think from time to time, certain discussions like this is very much important. So I appreciate the opportunity I was given for this conference. It's very, very productive and fruitful. I think it's a good eye-opener and thought-provoking.
It has been a tremendous learning experience. I've been dealing with ADB projects since a long time, and I'm also dealing with all the other MDBs in my country because I'm at the Ministry of Economic Affairs, which is the front office, dealing with all the development partners. So, most of the time we spend on our files and in offices, so this was a good opportunity to interact and actually see the work that's done, and especially the evaluation side of the MDBs, because we normally deal with the operational side. So looking at projects from the evaluation point of view has been excellent. I think the format was very good, but I think maybe for next time, maybe a segment on some case study or something where we can, sit together and evaluate some kind of a project. So I think that would be good if that can be added next time. Maybe we are asked to work on a little project, or maybe a project is presented. Otherwise, all in all, I think the hospitality was great, the arrangements were great, and I think it has been a fabulous time.
What a lovely way to bring this to an end. We are almost ready to say goodbye, but almost. We cannot go away without some last words, some recap, some acknowledgements. So for that, maybe please, first of all, invite Dr. Zhang Feng, Director General, SNI AFDI, to say some last words.
尊敬的梅德、阿里亚、维加亚董事、伊曼纽尔、西梅内斯局长，各位嘉宾、女士们、先生们，大家好。在这迭翠流金的初秋时节，我们相聚在中国最大的经济中心城市上海，相聚在黄浦江畔，共商绩效评价大计，共谋绩效管理事业的未来。在各方的紧密配合和共同努力下，2024亚洲评价周已经圆满地完成了预定的议程，即将胜利闭幕。在过去的4天里，我们紧密围绕绩效评价这样一个大家普遍关注的话题， 结合自身的理论研究的心得以及实践的体会，展开了深入而富有成效的交流和讨论。首先，主题凸显了需求驱动、问题导向的特点。2024年亚洲评价周的主题是创新提升评价影响力。创新是人类经济和社会进步的灵魂，也是绩效管理事业不断提质增效的内生动力。本次活动不仅展开了对绩效评价标准、流程和方式方法创新的讨论，还关注到新技术在评价中的应用。大家深入研讨绩效评价理论和前沿技术，积极探索绩效管理高质量发展的新路径，相互启发、相互借鉴，令人印象深刻。其次，内容丰富，议程充实。本次活动由20多场分议题组成，从政府投资的项目绩效评价、利用影响评价促进发展、国际发展与区域合作评价、人工智能和机器学习的应用等多个维度展开讨论和交流，展示出不同国家和地区绩效管理发展和改革的趋势。与会嘉宾们踊跃发言，分享见解，通过思想的碰撞，加深了认识，凝聚了共识。此外，形式多样，设计新颖。本次活动包括主旨演讲、圆桌讨论、专家点评、头脑风暴等各种类型，不仅提高了与会嘉宾的参与度和投入度，有助于保持参与者的兴趣与注意力，还激发了大家从不同角度、不同层面审视问题，促进了思维的多样性与创新性，提高了学习成效。诚如我们一直所强调的，亚洲评价周系列活动始终秉承着打造亚洲地区乃至全世界一流的绩效评价领域能力建设和交流沟通平台的初衷，致力于促进绩效评价经验和知识分享，展示绩效管理工作的优秀成果和重要进展。我认为本次活动确实达到了深化学习、增进交流、共同提升的目的，成功地体现了知识之桥、合作之桥的真谛，充分展示了参与各方在评价领域的优秀成果，为亚洲地区绩效评价工作的持续进步贡献了力量。朋友们，历届评价周活动之所以能够顺利举办并取得辉煌的成绩，离不开各方的精诚合作。借此机会，我仅代表上海国家会计学院对亚洲开发银行以及上海市财政局对本次活动的大力支持表示衷心的感谢，对积极参与本次亚洲评价周的相关国际组织、区域内各经济体、政府部门、学术机构表示衷心的感谢，也对本次活动双方的秘书处做出的辛勤努力表示衷心的感谢。最后，我宣布2024亚洲评价周胜利闭幕，希望大家带着收获满满的知识和友谊，带着中国人民的深情厚谊，带着对绩效管理工作的美好愿景，顺利返程。祝各位身体健康，工作进步，家庭快乐。期待2025亚洲评价周再见，谢谢各位。
So now I'd like to call on stage ADB Executive Director Madi Arya Vijaya. He's also Vice Chair of the Development Effectiveness Committee. ED Mare.
Dr. Zhang Feng in DG Mani Jimenez, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to initiate the closing session of the Asian Evaluation Week 2024. I want to congratulate ADB's Independent Evaluation Department on another very successful AEW. This event has become an important contributor to the development community as we seek new ways to address new and ongoing challenges. The role of independent evaluation is crucial for multilateral development bank like ADB. As an essential element of ADB's accountability mechanisms, it provides a credible assessment of ADB's organizational performance and valuable lesson for improving results for our developing member countries. As Vice Chair for ADB's Development Effectiveness Committee, or DEC, independent evaluation is a subject of a great importance to me. The DEC is dedicated to helping ADB's Board of Directors understand where our institutions are succeeding and where we can do better. Evaluation helps the board carry out its responsibility of ensuring that ADB's programs and activities achieve development effectiveness. At the opening session, DG Mani and AD Justin mentioned a few examples. I'm pleased to say that IAD systematically evaluates all ADB's operations, including policies and strategies. To ensure the independence of evaluation, IAD reports directly to the board through the DEC. For us on the DEC, development effectiveness measures two things: whether ADB programs and activities have resulted in the desired outcomes per its goals and objectives, and whether this program and activities have used ADB's resources efficiently. I come from Indonesia, and as many of you would know, Indonesia regained its upper middle income grouping last year, according to the World Bank income classification status. Further, the country has made enormous gain in poverty reduction, cutting the poverty rate by more than half since 1999. To sustain this gain, Indonesia needs to enhance knowledge-oriented sectors and processes, which are crucial for continued high growth and strengthening Indonesia's position. Evaluation knowledge from ADB has a huge role to play in countries like Indonesia, which have attempting to strengthen their economy. Looking back over the week, I am very happy with the range of a session and the quality of the discussion. Looking to the future, ADB will continue to rely heavily on evaluation, knowledge, and insights, particularly those of our independent evaluation independent. But it is important to note that we learn as well from so many of our partners in development and from their evaluation. There is no doubt that the demand for opportunities to exchange experiences, learning, and knowledge stemming from evaluation is increasing. The Asian Evaluation Week is an excellent platform that brings together evaluation practitioners and users of evaluation outcomes and encourages the sharing of ideas, data, experiences, and expertise. From this, we all benefit. Next year, we'll bring the 10 AEW, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2025. Let me close by thanking all of your participation. I wish you a safe journey home and all the best in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you, Edie. And before I call DG Manny Jimenez to come on and formally close AEW 2024, a quick announcement that after the closing, we welcome all of you to come onto the stage and take that annual photograph that we do at the end of every Asian Evaluation Week. So, Manny, calling you on the stage to formally bring this to a close.
Probably all thinking, oh, finally, the last time we see him this time. DG Sang, Edie Made, and distinguished friends and colleagues. There's too much to summarize here, so I won't do that. But I think that in terms of my own metric for success, I think AEW 2024 has met them. First, as DG Zhang mentioned, we all learned a lot, and he, I think, very articulately listed all of the issues that we discussed over the past 4 days. The second, aside from all this learning, I think that one of the great benefits of bringing us all together here physically, which we missed until last year for several years, is that we have continued to invest in the community of evaluators here in the region. Let me again go back to the concept, which I think is beautiful in China, of Guangxi. And there's, I believe, a saying in China, make friends first, do business next. And I think that embodies Guangxi, which is this network of relationships that are developed over the years. One of trust, and there are, I think, in many other cultures, similar concepts, paying it forward. In the Philippines, utang na loob, just debt of the heart, but they're all a little bit different, and I think Guangxi captures them all. And I believe in this forum, we have developed real Guangxi, which we hope to continue in the future. So, from learning and relationship building, it's been a huge success. What I didn't expect was I would also learn from the very beginning about how to behave as a professional in this field. Tim, I think, expertly led us in the beginning with very good advice to be calm, take context into account, and be curious. And with a few exceptions, I noticed all of you were pretty calm. Carmen mentioned earlier that he also alluded to the concept of are we soldiers or scouts, and I agree with you. We are not soldiers, but we can't be just scouts because scouts are what I call researchers. We actually are in the business of influencing things. And if I take the military analogy, I was thinking of we're commandos, special forces. We go out, we scout around, and when the opportunity offers itself, we need to strike and get evidence to bear. So with that, let me now do what I think is the most pleasant part, if bittersweet, of any conference, and that's to give people thank you. It's always dangerous because I have always missed somebody, and I have added to my list of enemies over the years. But let me ask you to withhold your applause until I ask you to, because otherwise you will not have lunch. So the first group I would like to thank, of course, are our AFDI partners. So let me just mention in brief, Linda Tan, Scott, Wang Lei, Amy Chan, Cheng Zhu Chao, Zhu Kenan, Jesse Bao, and last but not least, the international student volunteers who have been helping us outside. So please, a round of applause. Thank you very much for this partnership, AFDI, SN, and SNI. Second, of course, I've been shamelessly accepting your congratulations on this event, where even though the real work's not done by me, but by my colleagues. So let me mention them officially. I think you've met many of them, but not all. There is the IED team of staff and consultants led by Deputy Director General Sona. And let me mention them: Sonia, Saleha, Mayan, Twinkle, Julian, Cherry, Michi, Zeus, and also the consultants Connie, Herbs, Sel, Tamara, Kuchi, and Gambir. So please, let's all thank them. Let me also thank my other ADB colleagues who joined as panelists. And so we had Safdar Parvez here earlier, country director, and Nan Ma from PRCM, and the IED staff who joined as panelists: Maya, Nathan, Garrett, Yurendra, Gloria, Nash, and Hao Chi. So please. And of course, we had to thank those who took care of us and fed us these past 4 days. The contractors, Estella, the event manager, and the hotel staff of Conrad, led by Carrie. So with that, let me join my previous speakers in, well, no, one last thanks. I think all of you deserve a great round of applause, because I think that in terms of the energy with which you engaged throughout the 4 days, the learning and the networking would not have taken place. So please give yourselves all a round of applause. And with that, let me look forward to welcoming you to next year's AEW. Safe travels.